Love in the Time of Cholera. Chapter 2. This would be page 53. Florentino Arisa, on the other hand, had not stopped thinking of her for a single moment since Firmina Dassa had rejected him out of hand after a long and troubled love affair 51 years, 9 months, and 4 days ago. He did not have to keep a running tally, drawing a line for each day on the walls of a cell, because not a day had passed that something did not happen to remind him of her. At the time of their separation, he lived with his mother, Transito Arisa, in one half of a rented house on the Street of Windows, where she had kept a notions shop ever since she was a young woman, and where she also unraveled shirts and old rags to sell as bandages for the men wounded in war. He was her only child, born of an occasional alliance with the well-known shipowner Don Pius V Loayza. 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 One of the three brothers who had founded the River Company of the Caribbean, and thereby given new impetus to steam navigation along the Magdalena River. Don Pius V. Loayza died when his son was 10 years old. Although he always took care of his expenses in secret, he never recognized him as his son before the law, nor did he leave him with his future secure, so that Florentino Arisa used only his mother's name, even though his true parentage was always common knowledge. Florentino Arisa had to leave school after his father's death, and he went to work as an apprentice in the postal agency, where he was in charge of opening sacks, sorting the letters, and notifying the public that mail, page 54, had arrived by flying the flag of its country of origin over the office door. His good sense attracted the attention of the telegraph operator, the German immigrant Lotario Thugut, who also played the organ for important ceremonies in the cathedral and gave music lessons in the home. Lotario Thugut taught him the Morse code and the workings of the telegraph system, and after only a few lessons on the violin, Florentino Arisa could play by ear like a professional. When he met Firmina Dassa, he was the most sought-after young man in his social circle, the one who knew how to dance the latest dances and recite sentimental poetry by heart, and who was always willing to play violin serenades to his friends' sweethearts. He was very thin, with Indian hair plastered down, with scented pomade and eyeglasses for myopia, which added to his forlorn appearance. Aside from his defective vision, he suffered from chronic constipation, which forced him to take enemas throughout his life. He had one black suit, inherited from his dead father, but Transito Arisa took such good care of it that every Sunday it looked new. Despite his air of weakness, his reserve, and his somber clothes, the girls in his circle held secret lotteries to determine who would spend time with him, and he gambled on spending time with them until the day he met Firmina Dassa, and his innocence came to an end. He had seen her for the first time one afternoon when Lotario Thugut told him to deliver a telegram to someone named Lorenzo Dassa, who, with no known place of residence. He found him in one of the oldest houses on the park of the Evangels. It was half in ruins, and its interior patio, with weeds in the flower pots, and a stone fountain with no water, resembled an abbey cloister. Florentino Arisa heard no human sound as he followed the barefoot maid under the arches of the passageway, where unopened moving cartons and bricklayers' tools lay among leftover lime and stacks of cement bags. for the house was undergoing drastic renovation. At the far end of the patio was a temporary office where a very fat man, whose curly sideburns grew into his mustache, sat behind a desk, taking his siesta. In fact, his name was Lorenzo Dassa, and he was not very well known in the city because he had arrived less than 2 years before and was not a man with many friends. He received the telegram as if it were the continuation of an ominous dream. Florentino Arisa observed his livid eyes with a kind of official compassion. He observed his uncertain fingers trying to break the seal, the heartfelt fear that he had seen so many times in so many addressees, who still could not think about telegrams without connecting them with death. After reading it, he regained his composure. He sighed. Good news. And he handed Florentino Arisa the obligatory 5 reales, letting him know with a relieved smile that he would not have given them to him if the news had been bad. Then he said goodbye with a handshake, which was not the usual thing to do with a telegraph messenger, and the maid accompanied him to the street door, more to keep an eye on him than to lead the way. They retraced their steps along the arcaded passageway, but this time Florentino Arisa knew that there was someone else in the house, because the brightness in the patio was filled with the voice of a woman repeating a reading lesson. As he passed the sewing room, he saw through the window an older woman and a young girl sitting very close together on 2 chairs and following the reading in the book that the woman held open on her lap. It seemed a strange sight, the daughter teaching the mother to read. His interpretation was incorrect only in part, because the woman was the aunt, not the mother of the child, although she had raised her as if she were her own. The lesson was not interrupted, but the girl raised her eyes to see who was passing by the window, and that casual glance was the beginning of a cataclysm of love that still had not ended half a century later. All that Florentino Arisa could learn about Lorenzo Dassa was that he had come from San Juan de la Ciénaga, with his only daughter and his unmarried sister soon after the cholera epidemic, and those who saw him disembark had no doubt that he had come to stay since he brought everything necessary for a well-furnished house. His wife had died when the girl was very young. His sister, named Escolastica, was 40 years old, and she was fulfilling a vow to wear the habit of St. Francis when she went out on the street in the penitent's rope around her waist when she was at home. The girl was 13 years old and had the same name as her dead mother, Firmina. It was supposed that Lorenzo Dassa was a man of means, because he lived well with no known employment and had paid hard cash for the park of the Evangel's house, whose restoration must have cost him at least twice the purchase price of 200 gold pesos. Page 56. His daughter was studying at the Academy of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin, where for 2 centuries young ladies of society had learned the art and technique of being diligent and submissive wives. During the colonial period and the early years of the Republic, the school had accepted only those students with great family names, but the old families, ruined by independence, had to submit to the realities of a new time, and the Academy opened its doors to all applicants who could pay the tuition, regardless of the color of their blood, on the essential condition that they were legitimate daughters of Catholic marriages. In any event, it was an expensive school, and the fact that Firmina Dassa studied there was sufficient indication of her family's economic situation, if not of its social position. This news encouraged Florentino Arisa, since it indicated to him that the beautiful adolescent with the almond-shaped eyes, was within reach of his dreams, but her father's strict regime soon provided an irremediable difficulty. Unlike the other students, who walked to school in groups or accompanied by an older servant, Fermina Dasa always walked with her spinster aunt, and her behavior indicated that she was permitted no distraction. It was in this innocent way that Florentino Arisa began his secret life as a solitary hunter. From 7 o'clock in the morning, he sat on the most hidden bench in the little park, pretending to read a book of the most of verse in the shade of the almond trees, until he saw the impossible maiden walk by in her blue-striped uniform, stockings that reached to her knees, masculine-laced oxfords, and a single thick braid with a bow at the end, which hung down her back to her waist. She walked with natural haughtiness, her head high, her eyes unmoving, her step rapid, her nose pointing straight ahead, her bag of books held against her chest with crossed arms, her doe's gait making her seem immune to gravity. At her side, struggling to keep up with her, the aunt with the brown habit and the rope of St. Francis did not allow him the slightest opportunity to approach. Florentino Arisa saw them pass back and forth 4 times a day, and once on Sundays when they came out of High Mass. And just seeing the girl was enough for him. Little by little he idealized her, endowing her with improbable virtues and imaginary sentiments, and after 2 weeks he thought of nothing else but her. So he decided to send Fermina Dasa a simple note written on both sides of the paper in his exquisite notary's hand. But he kept it in his pocket for several days, thinking about how to hand it to her, and while he thought, he wrote several more pages before going to bed, so that the original letter was turning into a dictionary of compliments, inspired by books he had learned by heart, because he read them so often during his vigils in the park. Searching for a way to give her the letter, he tried to make the acquaintance of some of the other students at Presentation Academy, but they were too distant from his world. Besides, after much thought, it did not seem prudent to let anyone else know of his intentions. Still, he managed to find out that Fermina Dasa had been invited to a Saturday dance a few days after their arrival in the city, and her father had not allowed her to go, with a conclusive, "Everything in due course." By the time the letter contained more than 60 pages, written on both sides, Florentino Arisa could no longer endure the weight of his secret, and he unburdened himself to his mother, the only person with whom he allowed himself any confidences. Transito Arisa was moved to tears by her son's innocence in matters of love, and she tried to guide him with her own knowledge. She began by convincing him not to deliver the lyrical sheaf of papers, since it would only frighten the girl of his dreams, who she supposed was as green as he in matters of the heart. The first step, she said, was to make her aware of his interest, so that his declaration would not take her so much by surprise, and she would have time to think. But above all, she said, the first person you have to win over is not the girl, but her aunt. Both pieces of advice were wise, no doubt, but they came too late. In reality, on the day when Fermina Dasa let her mind wander for an instant from the reading lesson she was giving her aunt, and raised her eyes to see who was walking along the passageway, Florentino Arisa had impressed her because of his air of vulnerability. That night, during supper, her father had mentioned the telegram, which was how she found out why Florentino Arisa had come to the house, and what he did for a living. This information increased her interest, because for her, as for so many other people at that time, the invention of the telegraph had something magical about it. So that she recognized Florentino Arisa the first time she saw him reading under the trees in the little park, although it in no way disquieted her until her aunt told her he had been there for several weeks. Then, when they also saw him on Sundays as they came out of Mass, her aunt was convinced that all these meetings could not be casual. She said, "He is not going to all this trouble for me." for despite her austere conduct and penitential habit, Aunt Scholastica had an instinct for life and a vocation for complicity, which were her greatest virtues, and the mere idea that a man was interested in her niece awakened an irresistible emotion in her. Fermina Dasa, however, was still safe from even simple curiosity about love, and the only feeling that Florentino Arisa inspired in her was a certain pity, because it seemed to her that he was sick. But her aunt told her that one had to live a long time to know a man's true nature, and she was convinced that the one who sat in the park to watch them walk by could only be sick with love. Aunt Scholastica was a refuge of understanding and affection for the only child of a loveless marriage. She had raised her since the death of her mother, and in her relations with Lorenzo Dasa, she behaved more like an accomplice than an aunt, so that the appearance of Florentino Arisa was for them another of the many intimate diversions they invented to pass the time. 4 times a day, when they walked through the little park of the Evangelhs, both hurried to look with a rapid glance at the thin, timid, unimpressive sentinel who was almost always dressed in black, despite the heat, and who pretended to read under the trees. "There he is," said the one who saw him first, suppressing her laughter, before he raised his eyes and saw the 2 rigid, aloof women of his life as they crossed the park without looking at him. "Poor thing," her aunt had said. "He does not dare approach you because I am with you, but one day he will, if his intentions are serious, and then he will give you a letter." Forcing all kinds of adversities, she taught her to communicate in sign language, an indispensable strategy in forbidden love. These unexpected, almost childish antics caused an unfamiliar curiosity in Fermina Dasa, but for several months it did not occur to her that it could go any further. She never knew when the diversion became a preoccupation from her blood frothed with the need to see him, and one night she awoke in terror because she saw him looking at her from the darkness of at the foot of her bed. Then she longed with all her soul for her aunt's predictions to come true, and in her prayers she begged God to give him the courage to hand her the letter just so she could know what it said. But her prayers were not answered. On the contrary, this occurred at the time that Florentino Arisa made his confession to his mother, who dissuaded him from handing Fermina Dasa his 70 pages of compliments, so that she continued to wait for the rest of the year. Her preoccupation turned into despair as the December vacation approached, and she asked herself over and over again how she would see him and let him see her during the 3 months when she would not be walking to school. Her doubts were still unresolved on Christmas Eve, when she was shaken by the presentiment that he was in the crowd at midnight mass, looking at her, and this uneasiness flooded her heart. She did not dare to turn her head, because she was sitting between her father and her aunt, and she had to control herself so that they would not notice her agitation. But in the crowd, leaving the church, she felt him so close, so clearly, that an irresistible power forced her to look over her shoulder as she walked along the central nave, and then, a hand's breadth from her eyes, she saw those icy eyes, that livid face, those lips petrified by the terror of love. Dismayed by her own audacity, she seized Aunt Scholastica's arm so she would not fall, and her aunt felt the icy perspiration on her hand through the lace mitt, and she comforted her with an imperceptible sign of unconditional complicity. In the din of fireworks and native drums, of colored lights in the doorways, and the clamor of the crowd yearning for peace, Florentino Arisa wandered like a sleepwalker until dawn, watching the fiesta through his tears, dazed by the hallucination that it was he and not God who had been born that night. His delirium increased the following week, when he passed Ferminadasa's house in despair at the siesta hour and saw that she and her aunt were sitting under the almond trees at the doorway. It was an open-air repetition of the scene he had witnessed the first afternoon in the sewing room, the girl giving a reading lesson to her aunt. But Ferminadasa seemed different without the school uniform, for she wore a narrow tunic with many folds that fell from her shoulders in Greek style, and on her head she wore a garland of fresh gardenias that made her look like a crowned goddess. Florentino Ariso sat in the park where he was sure he would be seen, and then he did. Page 60. Then he did not have recourse to his feigned reading, but sat with the book open and his eyes fixed on the illusory maiden, who did not even respond with a charitable glance. At first he thought that the lesson under the almond trees was a casual innovation due, perhaps, to the interminable repairs on the house. But in the days that followed he came to understand that Ferminadasa would be there, within view, every afternoon at the same time during the 3 months of vacation, and that certainty filled him with new hope. He did not have the impression that he was seen. He could not detect any sign of interest or rejection, but in her indifference there was a distinct radiance that encouraged him to persevere. Then, one afternoon toward the end of January, the aunt put her work on the chair and left her niece alone in the doorway, under the shower of yellow leaves falling from the almond trees. Encouraged by the impetuous thought that this was an arranged opportunity, Florentino Ariso crossed the street and stopped in front of Ferminadasa, so close to her that he could detect the catches in her breathing, and the floral scent that he would identify with her for the rest of his life. He spoke with his head high, and with a determination that would be his again only half a century later, and for the same reason. "All I ask is that you accept a letter from me," he said. It was not the voice that Ferminadasa had expected from him. It was sharp and clear, with a control that had nothing to do with his languid manner. Without lifting her eyes from her embroidery, she replied, "I cannot accept it without my father's permission." Florentino Ariso shuddered at the warmth of that voice, whose hushed tones he was not to forget for the rest of his life. But he held himself steady and replied without hesitation, "Get it." Then he sweetened the command with a plea. "It is a matter of life and death." Ferminadasa did not look at him. She did not interrupt her embroidering. But her decision opened the door a crack, wide enough for the entire world to pass through. "Come back every afternoon," she said to him, "and wait until I change my seat." Florentino Ariso did not understand what she meant until the following Monday when, from the bench in the little park, he saw the same scene with one variation. When Aunt Escolastica went into the house, Ferminadasa stood up and then sat in the other chair. Florentino Ariso, with a white camellia in his lapel, crossed the street and stood in front of her. He said, "This is the greatest moment of my life." Ferminadasa did not raise her eyes to him, but she looked all around her and saw the deserted streets in the heat of the dry season and a swirl of dead leaves pulled along by the wind. "Give it to me," she said. Florentino Ariso had intended to give her the 70 sheets he could recite from memory after reading them so often, but then he decided on a sober and explicit half-page in which he promised only what was essential: his perfect fidelity and his everlasting love. He took the letter out of his inside jacket pocket and held it before the eyes of the troubled embroiderer, who had still not dared to look at him. She saw the blue envelope trembling in a hand petrified with terror, and she raised the embroidery frame so he could put the letter on it, for she could not admit that she had noticed the trembling of his fingers. Then it happened. A bird shook himself among the leaves of the almond trees, and his droppings fell right on the embroidery. Forminadasa moved the frame out of the way, hid it behind the chair so that he would not notice what had happened, and looked at him for the first time, her face aflame. Florentino Arisa was impassive as he held the letter in his hand and said, "It's good luck." She thanked him with her first smile, and almost snatched the letter away from him, folded it, and hid it in her bodice. Then he offered her the camellia he wore in his lapel. She refused. "It is a flower of promises." Then, conscious that their time was almost over, she again took refuge in her composure. "Now go," she said, "and don't come back until I tell you to." After Florentino Arisa saw her for the first time, his mother knew before he told her, because he lost his voice and his appetite and spent the entire night tossing and turning in his bed. But when he began to wait for the answer to his first letter, his anguish was complicated by diarrhea and green vomit. He became disoriented and suffered from sudden fainting spells, and his mother was terrified because his condition did not resemble the turmoil of love so much as the devastation of cholera. Florentino Arisa's godfather, an old homeopathic practitioner who had been Transito Arisa's confidant ever since her days as a secret mistress, was also alarmed at first by the patient's condition, because he had the weak pulse, the hoarse breathing, and the pale perspiration of a dying man. But his examination revealed that he had no fever, no pain anywhere, and that his only concrete feeling was an urgent desire to die. All that was needed was shrewd questioning, first of the patient, and then of his mother, to conclude once again that the symptoms of love were the same as those of cholera. He prescribed infusions of linden blossoms to calm the nerves and suggested a change of air so he could find consolation in the distance, but Florentino Arisa longed for just the opposite, to enjoy his martyrdom. Transito Arisa was a freed quadroon whose instinct for happiness had been frustrated by poverty, and she took pleasure in her son's suffering as if it were her own. She made him drink the infusions when he became delirious, and she smothered him in wool blankets to keep away the chills, but at the same time she encouraged him to enjoy his prostration. "Take advantage of it now, while you are young, and suffer all you can," she said to him, "because these things don't last your whole life." In the postal agency, of course, they did not agree. Florentino Arisa had become negligent, and he was so distracted that he confused the flags that announced the arrival of the mail, and one Wednesday he hoisted the German flag when the ship was from the Leyland Company, and carried the mail from Liverpool, and on another day he flew the flag of the United States when the ship was from the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, and carried the mail from Saint Nazaire. These confusions of love caused such chaos in the distribution of the mail and provoked so many protests from the public that if Florentino Arisa did not lose his job, it was because Lotario Thugut kept him at the telegraph and took him to play the violin in the cathedral choir. They had a friendship difficult to understand because of the difference of their ages, for they might have been grandfather and grandson, but they got along at work as well as they did in taverns around the port, which were frequented by everyone out for the evening, regardless of social class, from drunken beggars to young gentlemen in tuxedos who fled the gala parties at the social club to eat fried mullet and coconut rice. Lotario Thugut was in the habit of going there after the last shift at the telegraph office, and Don often found him drinking Jamaican punch and playing the accordion with the crews of madmen from the Antillean schooners. He was corpulent and bull-necked, with a golden beard and a liberty cap that he wore when he went out at night, and all he needed was a string of bells to look like St. Nicholas. At least once a week, he ended the evening with a little night bird, as he called them, one of the many who sold emergency love in a transient hotel for sailors. When he met Florentino Arisa, the first thing he did, with a certain magisterial delight, was to initiate him into the secrets of his paradise. He chose for him the little birds he thought best. He discussed their price and style with them, and offered to pay in advance with his own money for their services. But Florentino Arisa did not accept. He was a virgin, and he had decided not to lose his virginity unless it was for love. The hotel was a colonial palace that had seen better days, and its great marble salons and rooms were divided into plasterboard cubicles with peepholes, which were rented out as much for watching as for doing. There was talk of busybodies who had their eyes poked out with knitting needles, of a man who recognized his own wife as the woman he was spying on, of well-bred gentlemen who came disguised as tarts to forget who they were with the boatswains. With the boatswains on shore leave, and of so many other misadventures of observers and observed that the mere idea of going into the next room terrified Florentino Arisa, and so Lothario Thugut could never persuade him that watching and letting himself be watched were the refinements of European princes. As opposed to what his corpulence might suggest, Lothario Thugut had the rosebud genitals of a cherub. But this must have been a fortunate defect, because the most tarnished birds argued over who would have the chance to go to bed with him, and then they shrieked as if their throats were being cut, shaking the buttresses of the palace, and making its ghosts tremble in fear. They said he used an ointment made of snake venom that inflamed women's loins, but he swore he had no resources other than those that God had given him. He would say with uproarious laughter, "It's pure love." Many years had to pass before Florentino Arisa would understand that perhaps he was right. He was convinced at last, at a more advanced stage of his sentimental education, when he met a man who lived like a king by exploiting 3 women at the same time. The 3 of them rendered their accounts at dawn, prostrate at his feet, to beg forgiveness for their meager profits, and the only gratification they sought was that he go to bed with the one who brought him the most money. Florentino Arisa thought that terror alone could induce such indignities, but one of the 3 girls surprised him with the contradictory truth. "These are things," she said, "you do only for love." It was not so much for his talents as a fornicator as for his personal charm that Lothario Thugut had become one of the most esteemed clients at the hotel. Florentino Arisa, because he was so quiet and elusive, also earned the esteem of the owner, and during the most arduous period of his grief he would lock himself in the suffocating little rooms to read verses and tearful serialized love stories, and his reveries left nests of dark swallows on the balconies, and the sound of kisses and the beating of wings and the stillness of siesta. At dusk, when it was cooler, it was impossible not to listen to the conversations of men who came to console themselves at the end of their day with hurried love, so that Florentino Arisa heard about many acts of disloyalty, and even some state secrets, which important clients and even local officials confided to their ephemeral lovers, not caring if they could be overheard in the adjoining rooms. This was also how he learned that 4 nautical leagues to the north of the Sotavento archipelago, a Spanish galleon had been lying under water since the 18th century with its cargo of more than 500 billion pesos in pure gold and precious stones. The story astounded him, but he did not think of it again until a few months later, when his love awakened in him an overwhelming desire to salvage the sunken treasure so that Fermina Daza could bathe in showers of gold. Years later, when he tried to remember what the maiden idealized by the alchemy of poetry really was like, he could not distinguish her from the heartrending twilights of those times. Even when he observed her, unseen, during those days of longing when he waited for a reply to his first letter, he saw her transfigured in the afternoon shimmer of 2 o'clock in a shower of blossoms from the almond trees where it was always April, regardless of the season of the year. The only reason he was interested in accompanying Lothario Thugut on his violin from the privileged vantage point in the choir was to see how her tunic fluttered in the breeze, raised by the canticles. But his own delirium finally interfered with that pleasure, for the mystic music seemed so innocuous compared with the state of his soul that he attempted to make it more exciting with love waltzes, and Lothario Thugut found himself obliged to ask that he leave the choir. This was the time when he gave in to his desire to eat the gardenias that Transito Orisa grew in pots in the patio, so that he could know the taste of Ferminadasa. It was also the time when he happened to find in one of his mother's trunks a liter bottle of the cologne that the sailors from the Hamburg American line sold as contraband, and he could not resist the temptation to sample it in order to discover other tastes of his beloved. He continued to drink from the bottle until dawn, and he became drunk on Ferminadasa, in a brace of swallows, first in the taverns around the port, and then as he stared out to sea from the jetties where lovers without a roof over their heads made consoling love, until at last he succumbed to unconsciousness. Transito Arisa, who had waited for him until 6 o'clock in the morning with her heart in her mouth, searched for him in the most improbable hiding places, and a short while after noon she found him wallowing in a pool of fragrant vomit in a cove of the bay where drowning victims washed ashore. She took advantage of the hiatus of his convalescence and to reproach him for his passivity as he waited for the answer to his letter. She reminded him that the weak would never enter the kingdom of love, which is a harsh and ungenerous kingdom, and that women give themselves only to men of resolute spirit, who provide the security they need in order to face life. Florentino Arisa learned the lesson, perhaps too well. Transito Arisa could not hide a feeling of pride, more carnal than maternal, when she saw him leave the notion shop in his black suit and stiff felt hat, his lyrical bow tie and celluloid collar, and she asked him as a joke as if he was going to a funeral. He answered, his ears flaming, "It's almost the same thing." She realized that he could hardly breathe with fear, but his determination was invincible. She gave him her final warnings and her blessing, and laughing for all she was worth, she promised him another bottle of cologne so they could celebrate his victory together. He had given Ferminadasa the letter a month before, and since then he had often broken his promise not to return to the little park. But he had been very careful not to be seen. Nothing had changed. The reading lesson under the trees ended at about 2 o'clock, when the city was waking from its siesta, and Ferminadasa embroidered with her aunt. Until the day began to cool. Florentino Arisa did not wait for the aunt to go into the house, and he crossed the street with a martial stride that allowed him to overcome the weakness in his knees, but he spoke to her aunt, not to Ferminadasa. "Please be so kind as to leave me alone for a moment with the young lady," he said. "I have something important to tell her." "What impertinence!" her aunt said to him. "There is nothing that has to do with her that I cannot hear." "Then I will not say anything to her," he said, "but I warn you that you will be responsible for the consequences." That was not the manner Escolastica Dasa expected from the ideal sweetheart, but she stood up in alarm because for the first time she had the overwhelming impression that Florentino Arisa was speaking under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So she went into the house to change needles and left the two young people alone under the almond trees in the doorway. In reality, Ferminadasa knew very little about this taciturn suitor, who had appeared in her life like a winter swallow, and whose name she would not even have known if it had not been for his signature on the letter. She had learned that he was the fatherless son of an unmarried woman who was hard-working and serious, but marked by the fiery stigma of her single youthful mistake. She had learned that he was not a messenger, as she had supposed, but a well-qualified assistant with a promising future, and she thought that he had delivered the telegram to her father only as a pretext for seeing her. This idea moved her. She also knew that he was one of the musicians in the choir, and although she never dared raise her eyes to look at him during Mass, she had the revelation one Sunday that, while the other instruments were played for everyone, the violin played for her alone. He was not the kind of man she would have chosen. His foundling's eyeglasses, his clerical garb, his mysterious resources had awakened in her a curiosity that was difficult to resist, but she had never imagined that curiosity was one of the many masks of love. She herself could not explain why she had accepted the letter. She did not reproach herself for doing so, but the ever-increasing pressure to respond complicated her life. Her father's every word, his casual glances, his most trivial gestures, seemed set with traps to uncover her secret. Her state of alarm was such that she avoided speaking at the table for fear some slip might betray her, and she became evasive even when her aunt Scholastica, who nonetheless shared her repressed anxiety as if it were her own. She would lock herself in the bathroom at odd hours, and for no reason other than to reread the letter, attempting to discover a secret code, a magic formula, hidden in one of the 314 letters of its 58 words, in the hope they would tell her more than they said. But all she found was what she had understood on first reading, when she ran her to lock herself in the bathroom, her heart in a frenzy, and tore open the envelope, hoping for a long, feverish letter, and found only a perfumed note whose determination frightened her. At first, she had not even thought seriously that she was obliged to respond. But the letter was so explicit that there was no way to avoid it. Meanwhile, in the torment of her doubts, she was surprised to find herself thinking about Florentino Ariso with more frequency and interest than she cared to allow, and she even asked herself in great distress why he was not in the little park at the usual hour, forgetting that it was she who had asked him not to return while she was preparing her reply. And so she thought about him as she never could have imagined thinking about anyone, having premonitions that he would be where he was not, wanting him to be where he could not be, awaking with a start, with the physical sensation that he was looking at her in the darkness while she slept, so that on the afternoon when she heard his resolute steps on the yellow leaves in the little park, it was difficult for her not to think this was yet another trick of her imagination. But when he demanded her answer with an authority that was so different from his languor, she managed to overcome her fear and tried to dodge the issue with the truth. She did not know how to respond. She did not know how to answer him. But Florentino Ariza had not leapt across an abyss, only to be shooed away with such excuses. "If you accepted the letter," he said to her, "it shows a lack of courtesy not to answer it." That was the end of the labyrinth. Fermina Dasa regained her self-control, begged his pardon for the delay, and gave him her solemn word that he would have an answer before the end of the vacation. And he did. On the last Friday in February, 3 days before school reopened, Aunt Scholastica went to the telegraph office to ask how much it cost to send a telegram to Piedras del Moler, a village that did not even appear on the list of places served by the telegraph. And she allowed Florentino Ariza to attend her as if she had never seen him before, but when she left, she pretended to forget a breviary covered in lizard skin. Leaving it on the counter, and in it there was an envelope made of linen paper with golden vignettes. Delirious with joy, Florentino Ariza spent the rest of the afternoon eating roses and reading the note letter by letter, over and over again, and the more he read, the more roses he ate. And by midnight he had read it so many times, and he had eaten so many roses that his mother had to hold his head as if he were a calf and force him to swallow a dose of castor oil. It was the year they fell into devastating love. Neither one could do anything except think about the other, dream about the other, and wait for letters with the same impatience they felt when they answered them. Never in that delirious spring, or in the following year, did they have the opportunity to speak to each other. Moreover, from the moment they saw each other for the first time until he, reiterated his determination a half century later, they never had the opportunity to be alone or to talk of their love. But during the first 3 months, not one day went by that they did not write to each other, and for a time they wrote twice a day, until Aunt Scholastica became frightened by the intensity of the blaze that she herself had helped to ignite. After the first letter, that she carried to the telegraph office with an ember of revenge against her own destiny, she had allowed as an almost daily exchange of messages in what appeared to be casual encounters on the street, but she did not have the courage to permit a conversation, no matter how banal and fleeting it might be. Still, after 3 months, she realized that her niece was not the victim of a girlish fancy, and it had seemed at first, as it had seemed at first, and that her own life was threatened by the fire of love. The truth was that Scholastica Dasa had no other means of support except her brother's charity. And she knew that his tyrannical nature would never forgive such a betrayal of his confidence. But when it was time for the final decision, she did not have the heart to cause her niece the same irreparable grief that she had been obliged to nurture ever since her youth, and she permitted her to use a strategy that allowed her the illusion of innocence. The method was simple. Fermina Dasa would leave her letter in some hiding place along her daily route from the house to the academy, and in that letter she would indicate to Florentino Arisa where she expected to find his answer. Florentino Arisa did the same in this way for the rest of the year. The conflicts in Aunt Scholastica's conscience were transferred to baptisteries in churches, holes in trees, and crannies in ruined colonial fortresses. Sometimes their letters were soaked by rain, soiled by mud, torn by adversity, and some were lost for a variety of other reasons, but they always found a way to be in touch with each other again. Florentino Arisa wrote every night, letter by letter. He had no mercy, as he poisoned himself with the smoke from the palm oil lamps in the back room of the notions shop, and his letters became more discursive and more lunatic the more he tried to imitate his favorite poets from the popular library, which even at that time was approaching 80 volumes. His mother, who had urged him with so much fervor to enjoy his torment, became concerned for his health. "You are going to wear out your brains," she shouted at him from the bedroom when she heard the first roosters crow. "No woman is worth all that." She could not remember ever having known any one in such a state of unbridled passion. But he paid no attention to her. Sometimes he went to the office without having slept, his hair in an uproar of love after leaving the letter in the prearranged hiding place so that Fermina Dasa would find it on her way to school. She, on the other hand, under the watchful eye of her father and the vicious spying of the nuns, could barely manage to fill half a page from her notebook when she locked herself in the bathroom, or pretended to take notes in class. But this was not only due to her limited time and the danger of being taken by surprise. It was also her nature that caused her letters to avoid emotional pitfalls and confine themselves to relating the events of her daily life in the utilitarian style of a ship's log. In reality, they were distracted letters, intended to keep the coals alive without putting her hand in the fire, while Florentino Arisa burned himself alive in every line. Desperate to infect her with his own madness, he sent her miniaturist's verses inscribed with the point of a pin on camellia petals. It was he, not she, who had the audacity to enclose a lock of his hair in one letter, but he never received the response he longed for, which was an entire strand of Fermina Dasa's braid. He did move her at last to take one step further, and from that time on she began to send him the veins of leaves, dried in dictionaries, the wings of butterflies, the feathers of magic birds, and for his birthday she gave him a square centimeter of St. Peter Clavier's habit, which in those days was being sold in secret at a price far beyond the reach of a schoolgirl her age. One night, without any warning, Fermina Dasa awoke with a start. A solo violin was serenading her, playing the same waltz over and over again. She shuddered when she realized that each note was an act of thanksgiving for the petals from her herbarium, for the moments stolen from arithmetic to write her letters, for her fear of examinations when she was thinking more about him than about the natural sciences, but she did not dare believe that Florentino Ariso was capable of such imprudence. Page 70.